Hi everyone, this is a mini lecture on queerness, class, and prisons. Well, the emphasis is really on queerness and prisons. This is the PowerPoint presentation that I had intended to go through in the last class, but decided in the moment to prioritize discussion rather than rush things. So the topics that I'm covering today include class and labor as they intersect with queerness, at least to some extent, the history of mass incarceration and sexuality within prisons, queer people policing and prisons today, and that's it. Those are the topics. So these were just discussion questions about Joanna Cotty's homophobic workers or elitist queers. I will move on from here. These are some books that I would recommend checking out if you're interested in learning more about class, labor, and queerness. The first one, Queerly Classed, is where I took the Joanna Cotty reading from. And then Out in the Union came out just a few years ago. It's a fairly recent book, and it's an overview of the labor history, as it says, of queer America by Miriam Frank. And it really emphasizes the intersection between queer activism, or the intersection of queer activism and the history of the union movement in the United States, especially from the 1960s to the 1960s to the present. One really big moment in the history of queer labor activism was the Coors beer boycott, starting in around the mid 1970s. It started in San Francisco, and it was an alliance between queer activists and the Teamsters Union, because the Coors beer company was very anti-union and very anti-gay. For instance, they very explicitly refused to hire anybody who was gay, was out as gay, and even asked people applying for a job at the company if they were gay, right, to weed out queer workers. So the next book is Out at Work, Building a Gay Labor Alliance. This came out several years ago at this point. There's really not a ton that's been written about queer labor history. This is an anthology. And again, it's mainly about queer labor activism. So the fight by queer workers and allies in the workplace and in their unions to strengthen the rights of queer workers. So that means, things like fighting for non-discrimination clauses in union contracts, fighting so that health benefits would be employer-provided health benefits would also be provided to domestic partners. Of course, this is before gay marriage. And then during the AIDS epidemic, fighting for non-discrimination clauses in union contracts against, non-discrimination on the basis of HIV/AIDS diagnosis, because a lot of people were being fired or not hired because they were HIV/AIDS, HIV or HIV positive. And then other examples of more recent examples of queer labor activism include fighting for trans-inclusive health insurance. Many health insurance plans still don't provide transition-related services and procedures for trans workers. Let's see. Oh, fighting for all gender bathrooms in the workplace, so that trans workers have bathrooms to use, things like that. Let's see. Yeah, so I would recommend these books if you're interested. Okay, so I want to take a look at the rise of mass incarceration beginning in the 1970s, which is important context for having a more in-depth understanding of one, why gay activists and black activists made political alliances around bias in policing and incarceration, and two, why these alliances ultimately faltered by the late 1970s. This was, of course, what your reading was about last week. So in this chart, you can see that mass incarceration goes into overdrive beginning in the 1980s, but it's important to note that the ideological seeds are planted in the 1970s. So there's some background music from the gas station. Okay, so the civil rights movement was active in the 1950s and 1960s, the Black Power movement in the late 60s and 1970s. It's in the 1970s that we see the beginnings of mass incarceration, with Black Americans being imprisoned at appalling rates. So this is no coincidence. What we're seeing is a backlash against the Black freedom movement in particular. So this is a politics of backlash, the rise of mass incarceration. Under President Richard Nixon, the Republican Party in the 1970s, embarked on what it called the Southern Strategy. It wanted to recruit white people from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party to win political power. So white people in the South and elsewhere were primed to be won over by the Republican Party because of their simmering racial resentments. So the question is, why were they so resentful? By the mid-1960s, the Democratic Party had become essentially associated with the civil rights movement. This is because Democratic President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed various civil rights laws. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 are the big three. So this led to an increased bitterness by many whites toward the Democratic Party. So a lot of like working class and middle class whites, as long as, I guess whites from all classes, were members of the Democratic Party because of its long association with white supremacy. The Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy. That begins to change in the 1930s, and then by the 1960s, it undergoes this radical transformation and becomes essentially the party associated with civil rights, right? With, well, I guess I could say racial justice to some extent. So in the post-civil rights era, it's no longer okay to make appeals to white voters in explicitly racist terms. So the Republican Party first and the Democratic Party later uses what's called dog whistle politics. So that's dog whistle politics. So what do I mean? Basically, the Republican Party, then the Democratic Party later, especially by the 90s, uses thinly veiled racial appeals, speaking in seemingly non-racist terms, but the meaning is clear. So for example, Nixon and others in the Republican Party became the party of quote-unquote law and order, and they talked a lot about the chaos of the inner cities, right? The need to deal with crime and to deal with it very swiftly and harshly. So who lives in the inner cities by the 1970s? It's disproportionately people of color, particularly African Americans. In the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, white people had fled the inner cities to the suburbs in what was known as white flight. So the crime in question is drug use, but the clear intention is to keep the black population exploited and disempowered, right? Blackness criminalized, and to use coded racial appeals to win over white voters. So Nixon advisor John Ehrlichman even says explicitly that the war on drugs was about attacking black people and hippies. Quote, "Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did," unquote. So the intention wasn't to, or the political intent was not to solely deal with problems of drug abuse and the sale of drugs. It was actually part of this political backlash to the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, particularly the Black Freedom Movement. So incarceration rates began to skyrocket under Reagan, Bush, and Clinton from the 1980s through the 1990s. Though again, Nixon begins the war on drugs, the call for law and order, right, and the attacks on the black community in particular in the 70s. But we see policies being implemented successfully by the 1980s through the 1990s in particular. So in this graph, you can see the rise of mass incarceration. You can see that the U.S. leads the world in incarceration. This one shows racial disparities in mass incarceration. You can see that, for instance, 1/3 of younger black adult men will spend time in prison, while 1 in 17 white men in the same age group will. Here are some recommendations for if you want to learn more about mass incarceration. So that is the documentary The 13th, which I think is a decent overview. I think it's quite good, actually, overview of this history. And then The New Jim Crow. It's several years old at this point, but it's not too old. But it was a New York Times bestseller, and it demonstrates the main argument of this book is that the rise of mass incarceration has led to what Michelle Alexander called the new Jim Crow. So a lot of the ways that black people were disenfranchised and marginalized during the Jim Crow years, Jim Crow segregation, are happening again as a result of mass incarceration. For instance, former felons aren't not being able to vote in most states, right? So limiting the vote, the right to vote, discrimination in employment against Black Americans who were formerly incarcerated. So, you see the rise in employment-based discrimination affecting African Americans in particular. And then the book on the right is Dog Whistle Politics by Ian Haney Lopez. This came out just a handful of years ago. It's fairly recent. And this is about the use of coded racial appeals. And his argument is quite good because, or is interesting because he says that these coded racial appeals, like basically appealing to the racial resentment of white people in particular, has actually worked to the disadvantage of the middle class because people are so busy, attacking each other that they're looking the other way and not actually acknowledging or dealing with the problem of economic inequality and corporate exploitation and so on. And so the impact in terms of the class injustice has been also quite big. Okay, so on to talking more about queerness. So I want to briefly look at the longer history of sexuality, gender, and prisons before talking a little bit more about these topics in the context of the reading that you had to do. So with regard to policing, we know that queer identified people have historically been overly policed. Laws against sodomy and cross-dressing have made queer people in general subject to persistent police harassment from the late 19th century through most of the 20th century. So, right, sodomy, laws against sodomy and cross-dressing. Police have targeted queer folks through bar raids, right, raiding gay bars and arresting people, throwing them in jail, then publishing their arrest records, which results in people being alienated from their families and fired from their jobs. And then also police entrapment. Essentially, police would solicit, for instance, sex from another man. They would solicit sex in the park, and then if that man responded positively, they would arrest the person, so entrapping people, leading them to break the law. So as is usually the case, poor people and people of color have borne the brunt of this harassment. So poor people and queer people of color have borne the brunt of this harassment. It's also important to note that poor queer people and queer people of color have faced, right, police harassment and imprisonment always in larger numbers. Employment-based discrimination as well as family rejection has led some queer people to participate in the underground economy or to steal to survive, which puts them and continues to put them in a more vulnerable position vis-a-vis the criminal justice system. So what does the history of sexuality look like in prisons? Regina Kunzel, she's mentioned in your reading from last week by Timothy Stewart Winter. She has extensively examined the history of sexuality in prison. So bear with me as I explain her argument. If you have any questions, let me know when we're in class this week or next week. So Kunzel argues that the history of sexuality in prisons goes against mainstream views of sexual identity formation in the mid 20th century. So, this idea that by the mid 20th century, around 1940s, 50s, people increasingly and almost exclusively define themselves as gay or straight. There's no in between. You're either gay or you're straight. But sexuality within prisons and other same-sex environments, like boarding schools, aboard ship for sailors, etc., this has been referred to as situational sexuality, right? Sex with somebody, which essentially means sex with somebody of the same gender, is only happening because the people who are having sex with each other are in a context that promotes it. In prisons, men are cooped up with other men and women with women, so they have sex with each other, right? Their sexuality is situational rather than indicative of their sexual orientation. So they're just engaging in sexual activity. It's not about them being gay. So Regina Kunzel actually critiques the way that social scientists have discussed situational sexuality. She has described this discussion as ahistorical. She writes, situational sexuality may seem peculiarly, even obstinately ahistorical, produced by spatial arrangements that appear, at least in part, to transcend the historical, unquote. So in other words, there's no historical explanation for sexual behavior or sexual identity that acknowledges the influence of culture, science, and politics, in particular historical time periods, if we're talking about places like prisons, right? It's just, prisons are just sort of outside of history. She critiques this idea. She argues that sex between people of the same gender in prison should not be understood as, quote, marginal or oppositional. Instead, it has been occasionally buttressing, often disquieting, and always revealing of the fissures and fault lines of a modern sexual system in the making, unquote. So let's take prisons, sex in prisons in the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, prisons often segregated any man convicted of homosexual solicitation or cross-dressing, as well as those whose mannerisms suggested that he might lean in that direction. The logic being that fairies would entice, right, normal, quote-unquote, normal men to take advantage of their favors. So this should sound familiar. This isn't reflective of the timelessness of situational homosexuality in prison. It's actually reflective of urban working-class cultures in which more feminine men were the ones who were defined as homosexual, and they used the words like fairy to describe them. So by the middle of the 20th century, there was a growing concern that prisons were producing homosexuality, i.e. they were making people gay. In other words, there was this idea that homosexuality was catching due to sexuality within prisons. Regina Kunzel argues that the existence of sex between people who didn't define themselves as gay in prisons destabilized heterosexuality. Social scientists were anxious that sex between people in prison who didn't define themselves as quote-unquote homosexual might mean that heterosexuality is unstable, that there's no true binary of homosexuality and heterosexuality, that you're either one or the other exclusively. So Regina Kunzel concludes with this argument. Situational sexuality must be understood, then, not as a description of sexual acts produced by the presumably ahistorical forces of circumstance and environment, but as a rhetorical maneuver by which mid-century social scientists sought to contain the disruptive meaning of sexual acts apparently unlinked to and therefore unsettling to sexual identity. So I'll end with this quote by her, which I think is helpful, useful in understanding her ideas before moving on. Quote, loosening the grip of the identitarian framework on our historical and cultural imagination will, I think, reveal a messier, more various recent sexual past as well as sexual present, unquote. So in other words, we can get stuck in this identity-based history where you're gay or you're straight, right? And that can sort of hide the kind of messier and more varied, as she writes, history of sexuality, including queer sexuality. So let's take a brief look at queerness, policing, and prisons today. These are some revealing statistics. I'll start with a quote by one queer person in prison. This is taken from the book Captive Genders. Quote, "What hurts me the most is the lack of knowledge within the gay community in the free world concerning LGBT people behind bars. It makes me feel like my brothers and sisters in the free world could care less about us that are behind prison bars, or we must be the forgotten ones." Sorry, I wanted to hide my, or to not get notifications when people text me. So, gay, lesbian, and bisexual people are twice as likely to be incarcerated, and rates are even worse for trans people. Police frequently harass trans people of color. 57% of trans people are afraid to go to the police when they need it. Violence and neglect in prisons is rampant. Trans people are 10 times more likely to be sexually assaulted by prison staff. And trans people put into solitary confinement and routinely denied are routinely put into solitary confinement and routinely denied medical treatment. Right? Note the similarity to immigrant detention centers. And many trans people are put in prisons that don't align with their gender identity. Trans identity is very likely to be medicalized in most prisons, right? You have to be undergoing a proven medical transition to be considered trans and actually to be put into a prison of your that accords with your gender identity. Let's see what else. So, for instance, there's Cece McDonald, who went to prison for defending herself against a bigoted assault. She was a black trans woman who was put in a men's prison for a number of years. Okay. Let's see, in the next. This shows the incarceration rates of trans people and gender non-conforming people. So, for instance, you can see, right, lifetime rate for the U.S. population in terms of incarceration, it's 5%. For transgender women, it's 21%. If you're black and you're transgender or gender non-conforming, then you have a 47% chance of spending some time in prison. That's really huge compared to 5% for the lifetime rate of the U.S. population generally. So this bar graph shows racial disparities in LGBTQ youth homelessness and juvenile justice system confinement. While white youth are underrepresented among homeless LGBTQ youth and confined youth populations, black youth are overrepresented among both groups. Black youth made up just 14% of the total youth population in 2014, but 31% of the homeless LGBTQ youth population that year, and 42% of the confined youth population in 2005. So I'm going to end by just giving you a couple of recommendations if you want to learn more about this. There are other sources out there that are good, but I think these two are a good starting place. This book, Queer Injustice, the Criminalization of LGBT people in the United States, is quite good. And then Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment and the Prison Industrial Complex, which is edited by Eric Stanley. This one is an anthology, and it includes writings by queer people who are incarcerated. Okay, I'm going to end there. Just let me know if you have any questions. I think this was, of course, a bit longer than I intended. And there's more I could say, definitely. But in order to keep this a little short, I'm just going to stop.